Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game. So, I got a fun and exciting episode for you guys today because we're going to be talking about Cosam the Great Super Nintendo CD recreation project. If that name sounds familiar, I just recently featured one of their projects, the Sega Neptune, on the channel about a month and a half ago, and I will leave a link in the description below to that video. Basically, Cosam the Great is an engineer who enjoys retro games, and they like to basically try to recreate projects that never truly existed. And what better project to recreate than the Super Nintendo CD or the PlayStation CD, whatever you really want to call it. Back in the day, if you're not aware, Nintendo had a partnership with Sony to create a CD add-on or a CD-based console with the Super Nintendo cartridge slot on top, so you would have a new storage medium. It wasn't as advanced as something like the Sega CD that added in a bunch of graphical capabilities. It was just basically a new medium for the Super Nintendo to deal with. And if this sounds familiar, you can skip ahead to minute 2 where I go over all of the new news and talk about where this project could go in the future. But recapping, since it's been like 7 or 8 months, basically Cosam has been engineering an entire PCB to harvest and place the parts from a Super Nintendo on, as well as finding period pieces for basically the CD-ROM controller and MCU, so you can communicate between a CD-ROM, or in this instance a test image probably, to the actual Super Nintendo. Basically what that would look like is the CD-ROM would be reading the data off the CD and loading it into RAM, so that the Super Nintendo portion, the CPU, and everything else to draw the image would be executing that code. But like I said, it's not like the CD attachment is adding any sort of graphical capabilities or advancements in the Super Nintendo hardware in and of itself. It is just pivoting the storage medium up. And again, it's one of those things. This is a complete alt history project because obviously Nintendo went away from Sony, and Sony ended up making the PlayStation, which still clearly exists today, all the way to PlayStation 5. I'm sure somebody at Nintendo probably wishes that they had kept that partnership and kept one of the direct competitors off the market, maybe for the absolute future. But honestly, Cosam the Great does great work, and talking about the Neptune, like I said, full video link below, I'm sure they have the chops to pull this off. And just recently, Cosam the Great updated everyone on Twitter on the overall progress of the reverse engineering and re-engineering of this, and it definitely is going relatively smoothly, and there is a lot more going on under the hood and in the code here, so that's what we're going to be taking a look at today. But basically, there's been progress made between the Nintendo PlayStation and how it actually talks to the CD. There is some programmable logic that basically will communicate between the SFC, or Super Famicom in this instance, and the CD hardware. And you'll see here you get a bunch of images of the overall prototype. Now obviously, if this project sees the finish line, it'll be way more buttoned up like Neptune was, but this is kind of that process of engineering. You can clearly see there is a ground oscilloscope probe on there, so probably checking signals not only for the integrity but making sure the data is actually going through those signals. At least that would be my assumption. Again, I am not an electrical engineer. I know how to use an oscilloscope and mod stuff, but this is definitely above my pay grade. But you'll see here right down in the corner, and I'll go into a close-up in a bit, that is basically the CD controller from another Sony CD-ROM drive that can be used for this project, because even though it's smaller than the footprint of the part that would have been on the Super Nintendo CD, it is pin compatible and does the same thing, which means that it does exist out there, and obviously it exists in larger numbers than the prototype CD-ROM drive would have ever had. And that definitely is an important thing for this project, because if you couldn't find that chip, then it really would kind of be dead on arrival. And going back to some of the previous images of the Super Nintendo CD, again, you can see here just how much work actually goes into something like that. You have a GAL chip down below, basically hand-wired up into this prototype board with a lot of different bodges and grounds going different places, even with resistors on them. This is something that could take 3 months to finish, 6 months to finish. It could be a few years if this does see the finish line, but damn it, this is the type of stuff that excites me, and I think you will like too. And you'll see here they are able to find the CDX 1196, which is a functional equivalent and pin compatible model to the CDX 1800, which basically doesn't exist whatsoever on the market. So it is awesome that there is a CD-ROM drive out there that is going to be able to provide these donor chips to be able to make a Super Nintendo CD work, and that is pretty damn lucky that it is pin compatible and also basically the same part in a smaller package, because if this didn't exist, again, this project would basically go nowhere. Even if you could find that original prototype chip right there you see in the top right hand corner, there's really only 1 or 2 maybe left in the world if they even exist at all. So this is definitely something that's going to make this at least feasible moving forward in the future. You leave me a comment down below and you tell me if the Super Nintendo CD was remade and you could make one for yourself. Is it something you're interested in, or you just like hearing about it in video form? And you'll see here additional photos. The Super Disk BIOS is loading up, and that's because it has been dumped. And you'll see at the bottom it basically says not defined. My guess would be that that's basically trying to communicate with something that isn't either defined or isn't actually reading. And on the CD Test Player program version 1.0, you'll see it looks like it's reading track 1. That's how I'm interpreting it, at least. Serve would be send and receive would obviously be receive. So it seems like it's actually sending data over. You'll see that in hexadecimal, but it isn't really receiving it because FFFFFF would basically be absolutely nothing in hexadecimal. It would be a 0 or an empty value. Now, interestingly, somebody did talk about why not use the NEC V810 32-bit CPU, and if that doesn't sound familiar, it will in just a moment, because this was something that was supposed to happen for the Super Nintendo CD as well, but obviously that wouldn't have been on the Sony side of things, because we already know most of the hardware that is being used there to actually get the data from the CD-ROM over to the Super Nintendo. But it is an interesting thought experiment, because if this engineering project does come to fruition, the chips on the Super Nintendo CD really aren't that complicated whatsoever. And if you're wondering where the NEC V810 sounds familiar from, it is part of the NEC PCFX, which interestingly is getting a little bit of a poking around from the MiSTer FPGA devs out there. I'm not saying it's going to become a core, people are just looking at it, but fingers crossed maybe one day that's exactly what happens. But the reality is, if this project does get finished, I am sure that FPGA developers could make a Super Nintendo CD core, because honestly it really isn't doing all that fundamentally different of a job than an actual Super Nintendo. It's just sending data over a different way. So this is one of those things, unlike the Neptune, where we don't really have a core that combines all three of the things together into the Tower of Power just because of logic element issues. You could definitely have a Super Nintendo CD FPGA core, so if you didn't want to go out and do a completely complicated build like the Neptune, you would still have a situation where you could actually make one yourself. All you need to do to make it yourself, though, would just be to load up the core and go from there. But I can't stress out enough just how impressive these projects truly are. This is electrical engineering and design at the absolute apex of talent, and there's definitely going to be some more fun around the edges, because you'll see here West Mods was making a reproduction case of the Super Nintendo CD, the PlayStation Sony CD, whatever you want to call it. That thing had like 3 different acronyms back in the day. So it's one of those things, if you did want to 3D print one of these, if you did want to resin print one, definitely isn't cheap, but you could make an entire recreation of the actual SNES CD, have it on your shelf if you so wanted to. I totally get it's a niche product among niche products, but you know me, Video Game Esoterica loves his niche for sure, and this is absolutely something I would build and have on my shelf to play around with. And before you ask, no, there is only one game that runs on this quote-unquote hardware. No one else has ever made one before, so you'd have to wait for the dev community to decide whether or not they actually wanted to make anything. But even if it just ran one game, the level of talent on display here, basically thinking that you could bring the Super Nintendo CD back to life, I absolutely love that stuff. And like I said earlier in the video, the Super Disk boot ROM image was dumped and made available, which is a huge component of this. It's basically just the BIOS, so that you actually can get the software loaded up and everything communicating with itself. If that didn't exist, I'm sure you could probably reverse engineer it, but we're talking about another massive time sink. But you can grab the Super Disk boot ROM right here, and you can play around with it if you want, but honestly, without all the hardware, it really doesn't do all that much of anything. But Super Boss Gaiden, here is one game and one game only that will run on this Super Nintendo CD. It was basically made just for fun to say that, hey, a game does exist out there. But think of all the fun developers could have with something like this if it did exist in hardware or an FPGA core. Again, it's one of those things, we have MSU1, so we definitely have CD quality audio, but projects like this are just absolutely some real fun stuff to me. Basically reviving something that doesn't exist, it only has one unit in the wild known to actually exist, and making it something that you can actually hold in your hands, put on your shelf, hook up to your TV and play. That is 10 out of 10 gold in my opinion, and that's why I wanted to update everyone on this one, because it has about a minute, and I definitely check Cosam's Twitter page every once in a while to see if anything came out, and about 24 hours ago we finally got that update that at least I've been waiting for. That's the current situation with the recreation of Super Nintendo CD, and honestly, projects like this are absolutely catnip for me, because if you know me and you know the channel, you know I love obscure hardware, rare hardware, and hardware that never truly existed, and the idea that one day we could be playing around with a Super Nintendo CD, absolutely mind-blowing. But again, it could be 6 months, it could be a year, it could be 5 years till this is done. Cosam could end up with some sort of issue that makes the project completely not accomplishable. We just don't know yet, so we're going to have to be patient. But the minute this thing is ready to actually exist, I will will definitely have one on the channel, whether I build it or I partner with a modder like I did with the Neptune, because I am quite busy, because it's one of those things. I just want to see this project come to reality, even if there's only 10 units ever made, just so you can say that the Super Nintendo CD technically exists, and it is something that if you want to pick one up, you could play in your collection. That's just absolutely wild. Just think about all of the dozens, probably hundreds of hours that have been put into this project at this point in time, just for the sheer passion of making something exist that never truly did. But we're done. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, leave them down below, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.